Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Assure Be Sure virtual conference hosted by Beyond Clean in partnership with CCI and sponsored by 3M, a full day dedicated to exploring sterility and packaging in sterile processing. If you're just joining us, I'm Adam Okada, your host for the day. Troy Scroggins is an Esculap project manager and is responsible for the Esculap sterile packaging portfolio and helping hospitals optimize the reprocessing of surgical instrument sets. He has more than 8 years of experience managing upstream and downstream marketing activities of Class II medical devices to help provide better patient outcomes. Elmar Hyde is the Director of Global Marketing with a focus in sterile technology at Esculap. With over 33 years of experience within the global medical device market, Elmar is passionate about improving sterile supply management and processes. As an expert in international working groups for sterile packaging materials, Elmar is a highly sought-after industry expert and presenter. In SPD, we're always up for discovering the ins and outs of the products we depend on for sterilization. Well, this presentation will examine the manufacturing process for rigid sterile containers. From design and product testing to meeting the required clearances, Troy and Elmar will provide a detailed overview of the manufacturing process. So sit back and relax. It's time for your virtual tour. It's my pleasure to welcome Troy Scroggins and Elmar Hyde.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you to How It's Made Sterile Containers. I'm Troy Scroggins, the product manager for sterile packaging for Esculap, and I'm joined by Elmar Hyde, who's the director of global marketing for strategic technology with Esculap. We're going to discuss, how containers are made, but there's a few things I want to talk about first, which is, properly designed sterile packaging is important to maintain patient safety. It allows for delivery of a sterile set in the right place at the right time in the right sterile condition. Although we're talking about sterile packaging, please remember that the sterile packaging of the container itself can only do so much. It really relies on people and the machinery throughout the process to do their job properly as well. So, sterilization really starts and ends in the OR, from the aseptic presentation at the beginning of the case to the proper treatment of the instruments at the end of a case. It really allows, those sterile sets to be processed, but in addition, we also have to rely on SPD and everybody else, so from decontam to washing to prep and packs through the sterilizers doing their job and proper transportation in and out of the OR. So, today what we really want to talk about is, what a sterile container is, how it works, what guides the development of sterile containers, and then also talking more about the design itself, as well as the manufacturing process, and then also looking at the validation testing and the required pre-market clearances that are needed to present containers to the market. Modern sterile container era really began in 1970 in Europe. So they were introduced there first, and then in about the 1980s, they were introduced into the U.S. For Europe, CE certification is required to provide these products to the market, and in the U.S., we have the FDA clearances that are required. So in the U.S., the sterile containers are a Class II medical device and require this clearance before we can present them to the market. Throughout the other parts of the globe, the requirements and regulations vary by different countries, but a lot of them will depend on using the requirements of the U.S. or of the CE countries as part of their, acceptance to use it. One thing you want to consider is that, if you look at different sterile packaging, they work a lot on the same concept. So globally, between rigid containers and blue wrap, they really make up 90+% of the sterile packaging that's reprocessed. Okay, both are well known. Both have 30+ years of market, use and scientific use behind them. There's just slight differences in the products themselves, but like I say, a lot of the processes that go into the sterilizer and maintain a sterile barrier are very similar between all of them. So if you kind of look at it, the main thing is you look at these products and you take them into a sterilizer, it's important to know that they are not a closed system. So with that, it's not a closed or sealed system. It's actually an open system that allows sterilant to come in and out of the sterile barrier. It allows bacteria to be basically killed inside the sterile container. So if you kind of look, here's a quick overview of, the process itself, what happens in a sterilizer. So the first step is that basically the air is removed from the sterilizer. So with this, the vacuum removes the air, and then actually the heat and pressure rise in there as steam comes in. So that helps create steam that's going to actually then, the steam molecules will coat the instruments themselves, kind of in the third phase there, and inactivate any of the microorganisms. So that will allow everything to be killed. And then basically it will go through exhausting phase and then drying phase. So, the big thing is you kind of can see by these diagrams is that really you can see the penetration is coming in and out through the filters themselves. So, Elmar, could you maybe describe better how filters work?
Yes, certainly. I mean, it's quite important to make a point at the beginning. It's quite a common misconception that a filter acts like a sieve. In fact, filter use physically a totally different working principle. Single-use filters are most commonly made of multi-layered overlapping cellulose or polypropylene fibers. The cellulose or polypropylene fibers are intended to be used only once because the material may be fatigued by the sterilization. Reusable filters are made of polytetrafluoroethylene, PTFE, which isn't fatigued by the sterilization and may be reused because they are highly resistant against aging. They are hydrophobic, which means non-wetting, show a high density, and are resistant to high temperatures. These images show a diagram and electron microscope view of paper and PTFE filters. Note how they create a complex, tight pattern. In containers, these filters are held in place securely with retention plates. Now let's take a closer look on how the filter itself works. Steam and sterilant gases are considerably smaller than microbes and allowed to pass through the filter. The physical, mechanical, and electrostatic properties effects of the filter plays a role in its effectiveness. Airborne microbes are often bound to particles, such as to dust particles. Now, particles whose diameter is larger than the distance between the fibers generally cannot pass through the filter. In the case of smaller airborne microparticles, there are three effects in particular that cause separation, so they are not allowed to pass through. The first effect is called the interception effect. That means small particles that follow the airflow around the filter fibers are caught if they get too close to them. This effect increases when the particles are larger or the distance between the fibers is smaller and if the fibers are present in greater numbers. Second effect, it's what we call an inertial impaction. That means larger particles cannot follow the airflow around the fiber due to their high inertia. Instead, they come into contact with the fibers and are caught. Inertial impaction increases with faster airflow and as the size or weight of the particles increases. Finally, the diffusion effect means that very small particles do not follow the airflow either, but collide with air molecules and ultimately collide with the filter fibers and are caught. The container design is another important aspect of maintaining sterility after sterilization. As we mentioned, containers aren't a hermetically closed system. They must be able to breathe. Now, Troy, can you describe how and why containers have a gasket instead of seal between the container bottom and lid?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in Louis Pasteur's germ theory, he demonstrated how this open system that you mentioned can maintain sterility. So, these are very simple diagrams here, but the idea is that in the top diagram is that really they have what's called a tortuous path. So basically, because germs are usually carried by dust particles and everything, basically a tortuous path means that they're not allowed to penetrate and get into the into the sealed area. So on the bottom diagram, if you would remove that tortuous path, you can see you can get microbiological growth. If you take that concept and you apply it to a container, what you'll see is that that's the same type of thing, is that the way the lid and the bottom meet to each other create that tortuous path, so that nothing can pass through it. So it is not a sealed system, but it is a gasket that creates that tortuous path, that maintains that tortuous path. This concept, as I mentioned before, is has been around for many years, and for 30 plus years, this tortuous path, and then the filter concept that we talked about, and the principles of particle separation have really helped maintain how sterile containers work. So now we've kind of looked and understand that aspect of it. What I'd like to do is kind of go to our second topic, which is really discussing what guides the development of sterile containers. So Elmar, can you maybe describe from a global standpoint, what kind of guides this?
Yeah, from a global point of view, as a manufacturer of rigid containers, we follow the international standards for sterile packaging materials, the ISO 11607 series, as well as a European series of standards, which is called the EN 868 standard series, dealing with different type of packaging materials such as nonwovens, pill pouches, rigid sterile containers, and such different type of systems. Now, these ISO standards specifies requirements for the design of sterile barrier systems and packaging systems for medical devices. It gives basic attributes required of materials and preformed sterile barrier systems, and it is written as a more general standard, considering a wide range of potential materials, medical devices, packaging systems, designs, and sterilization methods. This ISO standard does not provide lots of details, such as about handles of a container or stacking ability and things like that. This is more what the European standard series provides. They go in more detail, such as specific sizes, which we will comment on in a minute, maybe. Some examples for general requirements for sterile containers written in these standards are, for example, a container needs to be fitted with a tamper evidence system to show when the closure integrity has been compromised, or it shall provide a barrier of microorganisms during removal from the sterilizer, transport, and storage. And it shall be constructed to facilitate inspection of all essential parts, of course. And if degradation is anticipated, manufacturer needs to specify the number of cycles, or performance test method, or visual inspection along with acceptance criteria to allow customers to deal with that. Now, Troy, maybe you give us a quick idea how ST79, or in this case better ST77, guides us into the design for sterile containers.
Yeah, so like Elmar said, so if you look at the references he's referring to are very more broad, so in the U.S., all facilities here are really familiar with AAMI ST79, which kind of tells facilities how, the general guidelines on, best practices and how to handle items like sterile containers in their facility. AAMI also has a document that's manufacturer facing, which is the ST77. So it's, a lot of it is leveraged or based off those global documents that Elmar talked about, but the main difference is that it goes into a lot more detail. So, here's just kind of a high level overview of some of the items that it includes. Is it really talks about the materials, that the products are constructed of, and their biocompatibility, which I mentioned before, their design, their ability to stack both either internally or externally, which would be with inside the container or inside the sterilizer, and then externally be during storage. Additionally, they look at gaskets and, the closure devices that are involved, performance, Another key one is documentation. What documentation is needed to capture any changes anything you do that way, as well as what documentation is needed to provide to end users. One of the key areas that's different too is, like I said, we tend to go into more detail than the global standards, but one area they go into more detail, and Elmar alluded to this, is really the dimensions or sterilization unit. Can you kind of talk about maybe why that's important, Elmar?
Yeah, that's one more detail which is really specified in the ISO standard and in the EN standard for containers, and it's about sizes. As you know, standards are made to make sure that things just fit together. Just to make sure that screws and nuts, for example, fit each other and are not developed in total different ways and directions. And so the ISO standard includes that a container, inclusive all connected parts such as carrying devices, shall fit within one sterilization module. Now, what is that, a sterilization module? It's a rectangular module of a dimension of 300 millimeter height times 600 millimeter length times 300 millimeter width. And the purpose of this standard is that it ensures that every reusable rigid container fits perfectly into a standard steam sterilizer chamber, because at that point the standard for rigid containers is linked to the standard for large steam sterilizers. So really it makes sure that the systems simply fit together in your place at the customer's sterile reprocessing department.
Yeah, that helps a lot, if you, by having that standard unit of measure, so that you can, like you say, the containers and the other aspects, if it's the racks or if it's the sterilizer, all can interact better. I mean, there are some products that may go outside those standards, but everything's really based off those standards. Now you kind of have an understanding of the guidelines, that direct and develop the containers themselves. What we want to look at now is maybe more, let's go into more of the container design. What are the elements that you look at when you do that more detailed dive of a container design? And the other thing too is we want to look at what is the manufacturing process. So, maybe you can kind of start us off, Elmar.
Well, industrial standards and technical requirements is one thing. Of course, it needs to be regarded and checked carefully and make sure that we could fulfill this based on the different regulations in the in the United States and in Europe. The other side is, or the maybe even more important thing for us as a manufacturer is, well, how does a sterile rigid container system helps you in your job to be done in your daily life? That means at the very beginning of a R&D and construction process, we do, for example, in a detailed market research. We really need to know to properly gather user needs and get a good idea what is the goal we want to achieve with such a product. The goal is to provide a product that improves patient safety, of course, and increased efficiency through all aspects of the reprocessing cycle. So we need to have a closer look on processes throughout the reprocessing cycle and into the different requirements at the different steps of this cycle, such as transportation, storage, use, cleaning, handling, efficiency, labeling, everything which happens on different interfaces around the logistic process of sterile goods reprocessing. It's also important to understand the needs and develop relationships with ortho, spine, and robotic companies to help them to develop pre-configured instrument sets that fit within our container systems. All the major global container manufacturers offer a wide selection of sizes, features, and accessories to meet the diverse needs of users and the various instrument sizes. Now, Troy, you maybe go a little bit more into detail what a container really is about in terms of different parts around the container.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you look at the makeup of a container, you can see by this diagram here, in addition to the lid and the bottom, which are made of aluminum, there are many other components to it. and these other components may be made of different materials. So, most commonly, it may be steel, which would be like the latches or the handles, or PEEK, which could be used in a latch, or in our case, a retention plate. So PEEK is a highly durable plastic that withstands the heat and the reuse. Also like for baskets, which we don't have a basket pictured in here, but baskets are most commonly stainless steel, but maybe aluminum too. So, when you look at all those aspects, you can see you're bringing these different components together, and each has a different wear characteristic. Another key thing is that, the gasket is a non-latex silicone gasket, so that, again, we kind of mentioned keeps that relationship between the lid and the bottom. So, one of the questions, I think a lot of people asked is, why is aluminum the main metal for containers? I think you have a lot of background on that, Elmar.
Yeah, well, of course, you could ask the good question: why aren't we making containers out of stainless steel, for example? Because all the instruments are made of stainless steel, or our tables and a lot around in the RA and industrial supply facilities is made of stainless steel. Now, of course, every material has its pros and cons, and one big disadvantage of stainless steel simply is the weight. So if you want to make it with the same stability like aluminum containers show, it would be very, very heavy. So one big advantage of using aluminum is it's lightweighted. It has also a high mechanical strength. And no doubt there's a high corrosion resistance as well with aluminum. One very important aspect is that, different from steel or plastic materials, aluminum shows a very good thermal conductivity and heat storage capacity, which definitely helps you during the drying process after sterilization with the container. It has a comparatively high level of corrosion resistance. It's magnetic neutral, and its material characteristics make it ideal for the manufacturing deep drawing process. It will be very difficult to get these specific patterns and designs of modern type of containers out from steel material. It's not that easy to deep draw it in such a specific design. So aluminum is the currently best material we would have. Now let's have a look on how all these parts come together during production. The raw material which we receive as a manufacturer is of consistent quality, so exactly as specified, for example, in European and ISO standards. Nevertheless, it still goes through a raw material inspection process to confirm quality and make sure no damage occurred during transportation. After inspection, it's ready for the initial manufacturing processes. We have prepared a short video that shows the three main segments of the prefabrication process, which is deep drawing, forming and trimming, and washing and inspection. Please note that this video shows a fully robotic deep drawing and forming manufacturing process. Many manufacturers will use a more manual process of moving parts between these different process steps. Now, after the prefabrication process, the containers are inspected and then go through the anodization, and finally to a final assembly process. We will talk more about why containers are anodized in a minute. After anodization, the containers getting inspected, followed by final assembly, which includes, for example, laser marking with product information, QR codes or data matrix on the container, mounting faceplates and handles for the container bottoms, or adding latches for lids and some other parts in the container. We as a manufacturer all make all these parts internally. At the end, containers, finished containers and lids go to the warehouse and will then be shipped to the final user. Now, let's talk more about why and how we anodize containers and learn more about the anodization process.
Yeah, so if you look at the anodization process, unlike stainless steel, aluminum doesn't have a natural protection against corrosion. So when exposed to oxygen, non-anodized aluminum naturally builds up an oxidation layer. So with that, you may see a change in color over time with the metals. So it is safe to make containers out of anodized aluminum. It's just you may see that change. The more common method is to anodize the aluminum during the manufacturing process. So what this does is places a protective layer on the metal, using a electrochemical process. This helps prevent the oxidation and also makes it more scratch resistant and wear resistant. There are differences in anodization processes. Also there's different types of anodization, but the general process is the same no matter which method you're using. So if you look at this diagram, you'll see that basically the metal will start in its natural state, the non-anodized state, and just from natural movement, there'll be some soil on there, maybe some oxidation layer on there. So the first step is really to degrease and etch that. So with that, that's to clean off that top layer and smooth out any possible imperfections. The other thing too is then like the last step of the preparation for preparing the metal is the pickling process. So with this, the biggest thing is that it's finalizing the metals and opening up the metals pores to accept that anodization. So as part of the anodization process, the actual anodization is applied through, like I say, an electric chemical technique. If there's color involved, it would be added at this time too. So like I say, you see either a silver or a blue lid. At this time, if it was a blue lid, the blue would be added. So then the biggest thing is that then the actual product is sealed. So that creates that nice finish that you see, that hard finish that you see. The big thing is that, all these processes are really guided by iOS and other standards, as well as, the parameters are continually monitored throughout the process. And then at the end of the process, again, you have to make sure that you've inspected the product, make sure that there's a good sealant, make sure that it's the right thickness, to go forward with manufacturing the container. If you look at containers, like I say, the anodization does really make it a lot more, high resistance, surface. But the biggest thing is that anodization is still very sensitive to acids and or high alkalines. So, if you look at any of the manufacturers, IFUs, all the container manufacturers have specific steps in there on how to clean and handle their containers. With that, there's multiple reasons. One is to maintain that nice anodized finish, and the other two is to maintain or achieve proper cleaning. So, the biggest thing is as an end user is really understanding that your process may vary some, and you got to make sure you understand your process and how to adjust it so it fits all the different manufacturers. So if you look at from an end user standpoint, there's the machines, the chemistry, the temperatures that you use, and the time you're exposing everything to, as well as the water concentration or water quality and steam quality. So those all take a play, but it's really more the acids and alkalines that have the biggest effect on the container finish. So if you kind of look at, so now we've kind of talked about, what a container is, what guides the development of it, how they're manufactured, so the biggest thing is that we still have to look at how do you actually present one to market. So, the biggest thing is that when you're presenting a container to market is that you need to do validation testing. You have to get the required pre-market clearances. So now let's take a look at that in more detail. Elmar, I'll let you kind of start with the global view.
Well, as a global manufacturer, we can say that the US and CE countries have the most stringent requirements related to the pre-market certification of sterile rigid containers. Other parts of the world, they may have their own standards or leverage these standards. But basically what we do, we put this package together from requirements we would need for the US, for the FDA, and for the European markets. And actually this package is more than enough also to get clearance in every other market in the world. Now the CE clearance itself includes all markets, obviously, of the European community, which are currently 27 countries. And it's based on the requirements of the European Medical Device Regulation, the MDR, which is a law. For medical products such as a rigid container, it's a self-certification process. That means all manufacturers need to prove in their device master files and based on documented evidence that they fulfill the requirements of the MDR. And this is regularly checked by audits from different advisory bodies. For the validation of processes at the customer site, customers determine their own parameters based on their facility's worst-case scenarios and based on their machinery, water, and chemistry. Usually every year, the customer is, based on that, doing a re-validation of his entire sterilization process in terms of the machines and the washer disinfectors. The ISO standard 11607 Part 2 provides guidance for that procedure to the customers. Now, how does this work in the US, Troy?
Yeah, so in the U.S., kind of mentioned, so the biggest thing is that in the U.S. is that we don't do self-certification. We get basically FDA clearances, with that, sterile containers are a Class 2 medical device, which means they're more complex or considered that they could be a potential risk. So what that is that we have to provide significant documentation, validation testing, intended use, and instructions for use to the FDA to have them review it. And basically, the big thing is that they're clearing us to market it, but they're not necessarily approving it or endorsing the product. So that just means that they've looked at all the criteria that they have that's needed for containers, and then we look at all the testing and documentation we provided and say, yes, we have enough documentation and maybe a predicate device, which means something similar to it in the past, that they then clear it for marketing. So another thing too is really understanding the difference between validation testing and verification. Okay, so a lot of times customers will ask if they can validate a container in a different process or in their own facilities. So really, validation is not permitted by healthcare facilities. They typically don't have the equipment nor the experience to do the proper validation testing. So, it's really the container manufacturer that bears the ultimate responsibility for the validation testing and achieving those clearances from the FDA. On the healthcare side, they really bear the responsibility of using those containers per the recommended IFU from the manufacturers, and then making sure that they check that they can verify them in their own facilities. So if you follow the IFU, can I achieve the same results as listed in the IFU? So that's the main difference there, is the difference between the validation and verification on a facility. The other thing to look at too is that when we do testing, when we do our validation testing, it's really important to notice that it's done on multiple units. So with that, it's done on a best, worst, and mid case. So for containers, if we were taking a new series of containers, you'd look at the best, worst, and mid case, and those would be based on vent to volume. So based on the surface area of the filter versus the volume of the container, you'd look at those and determine which models you need to check. Another thing, or need to test. Another thing that's important too is that anytime you do this test, you're doing it in triplicate, so that it's not just one container did it, it passed, it's good. It's, by doing it in triplicate, you're showing that it can be repeated and that you've met the acceptable criteria for that. The other thing too is that you have to look at, in addition to steam, when you look at the other cycles and you look at a lot of the low temp cycles, you'll notice there's different cycles within each of them, either a flex cycle or standard cycle or anything. And all those need to also have proper testing done so that you can claim those different modalities and different cycles. So the final thing is that, so once you do have clearance, if you're making a new product or making an adjustment to a product, it's really key as a manufacturer that we have to make sure this new product is not a new worst case. So if it falls outside the current clearance or not, that's something we have to determine. So basically, the FDA provides a decision tree that kind of walks you through: is do you need to do a new FDA submission? Do you need additional testing, or are you able to do what's called a letter to file, which means that basically you're internally certifying that this is within the current parameters, and all. So the biggest thing too is that, as a manufacturer, we have to make sure we maintain accurate device history records and files, both from a manufacturing standpoint and a regulatory standpoint. Now we're going to look at the tests in a little bit more detail. So there's lots of different tests. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but so the ones listed here are some of the key tests. So if you look at sterile efficacy, with this confirms how effective the sterilizer is. So it's basically a sterile assurance to the level of 10 to the -6 that every microorganism has been killed. And the other key thing about this cycle is that it's a half cycle. So in the case of a steam sterilizer, instead of doing a 4-minute cycle, it's actually a 2-minute cycle. So it's placed in the most difficult spot in the sterilizer. So basically, it's all the worst case scenario and showing that you still can achieve, sterility assurance. So the other test is simulated use. So simulated use basically is trying to replicate a clinical use. It's done with a full cycle with a soiled instrument, showing that in a clinical use with a soiled instrument, you still can achieve, sterility assurance. And then another thing too is because containers are reusable, the material compatibility study is very important. So what this is this is a repeat study. So basically, the containers are usually done 100 times, to show that from the first cycle to the 100th cycle, there is no degradation of the product itself. So that test is really more looking at the wear and tear of it over time. And then usually that test is followed up by a aerosol challenge. So an aerosol challenge is ran after the material compatibility test, and shows that the barrier and the container was still able to maintain integrity. And then another test is the sterile penetration. So with this, as you have different size containers and different configurations, it's very important to make sure that all the sterilant can reach every corner of it. So basically, this test is meant to confirm that either using indicators or temperature sensors that every section of the container does achieve sterilant penetration. In addition to these tests, there's just a few more. The next one is a pretty straightforward test. So that's, of course, steam only is the dry time. So with that, what it is looking at what is a standard dry time. So, that's taking a fully loaded set and looking at if you did that, how do you achieve dryness? And, to achieve dryness, you have to basically show that it's visually dry and it's there's no increase in the percent of weight, from the moisture. So, a key thing to go off a little bit is that even though we claim certain dry times and our RFUs or our competitors do, the biggest thing is when you take that and you put it into a facility, you may have different dry times based on your loads, your sterile, your water, your steam quality. All those things can play a factor into that. And then shelf life. So shelf life is based on exactly like it sounds. It's, basically, if you're going to use this product for later, it's a real-time shelf life. So with that, it is, let's say in our case, we put it on the shelf for 365 days, and it's moved around occasionally to basically represent a worst-case scenario and show that still contain package integrity. And then immediate use sterilization, that's pretty straightforward too. That's just basically confirming at the end of immediate use cycle with no dry time that the package can maintain, sterility and achieve proper assurance. Biocompatibility is looking at the product itself. So this looks more at the materials that the container is made of and, puts it through some different tests, including some cytotoxicity tests, sensitivity tests, and irritation tests. So that's making sure that even though the product doesn't come in direct contact with customers, that there's nothing in the product that may come off onto the instruments and, bother a person or bother anybody who's interacting with it. And then finally, I kind of mentioned this before, is the cleaning validation. So basically the other thing too to look at is that now you have this container, how do you clean it? So the cleaning validation, is basically following the IFU and showing that you can achieve full cleanness if it was a non-properly cleaned product. So, those are many different tests, and there's are some additional tests in top of this, but these are the key ones that are really done for every manufacturer looking to sterilize containers and make them available for the market.
Yeah, well, as we reach the end of this topic on how sterile rigid containers are made, let's summarize on some key messages we just brought up in this session. A container as a sterile packaging system is an important factor to avoid infections. That means a properly designed sterile packaging system is so important to maintain patient safety. It allows you to deliver sterile sets to the right place, in the right time, in a proper sterile condition. Therefore, please treat them properly. This is a medical device and not just a metal box. The life of a container is based on proper handling and is in inspection as described in every IFU. And there's from all manufacturers, technical service, repair service, of course, available. Please remember the healthcare facility bears the ultimate responsibility to follow the IFU, to perform verification testing and policies to achieve the proper outcome of the usage of a rigid sterile container system. Now, Troy, it's up to you to finalize this session.
So, yeah, thank you. So, if you look at, everything we talked about a lot of different things today. So the biggest thing is really looking at, what a sterile container is, and, that it's not a closed system, but how does it work? Really, it achieves sterility and maintains sterility, by the filter and using the particle separation principle, and by using Louis Pasteur's, theory of basically the tortuous path between the lid and the bottom. We also talked about, the different guidances, both the ISO guidances and the global guidances that are included in those standards, and then the more detailed guidances that are available in the U.S. through AAMI's ST79. So in addition, other things to look at was basically the development of the container. So what to consider when you're developing it, looking at users' needs in each step of the process, as well as how a container is deep drawn, and the purpose of anodization. So, and then finally, we kind of, really talked about what's important to get that pre-market clearances and all the testing that's done, to make sure that, we really ultimately deliver a great product to you and you guys deliver, full patient safety to our end users, the patients themselves. So, we thank you for your time. We hope you found this very educational. We do have some time for some questions now. Thank you very much.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started with the Q&A with Troy and Elmar here. We're bringing them back on. Hi, guys.
Hello.
All right, so everybody can hear me. That's great. I want to start with Elmar real quick because this is a question that I've had probably an argument in every sterile processing department that I've ever worked in. It's one thing that I really just want to end the debate once and for all right here today. How do you pronounce Aesculap?
Well, from a German guy, I can tell you the German version, which is Aesculap. And that's deriving from the Greek god of health, which is in Greek language is Asklepios, or in Latin Aesculapius, and that ends up in Aesculap. So you're quite fine the way you pronounce it.
Okay, and then Troy, how about you? How do you pronounce it in America? How do you pronounce it?
Yeah, Aesculap, like you said, yeah. So it's not.
Okay.
I can't do that extra draw like he can with the.
Yeah, but it's good. You know what? While I had somebody from Germany here on the webinar, I wanted to finally get what is the pronunciation. I have heard literally dozens of people say it a dozen different ways, so I just wanted to clear that up real quick. We do have some great questions, so I'm going to go ahead and get started with the questions for you guys, and not nonsense questions like I just asked. But why are the containers anodized? Is the first one here.
Yeah, I think there's two of them here. I'm going to kind of piggyback them together. The question of why containers are anodized is, if you look at the containers, Aluminum has different properties than like stainless steel, where stainless steel has a natural protection against corrosion. Okay, so aluminum basically will oxidize over time and maybe change its finish some. So not all containers are anodized. The majority of them are, but the real thing is that they're anodized to create a protective surface on there, give it a little bit longer life. And all, another key thing kind of related to that is really taking care of that anodization, making sure that you take care of that finish. It still is a chemical that in a finish on there, you have to make sure that you're using the right pH, or the right water, the right processes to maintain that over time as well. So, and then kind of the other question that's on our list here is, during the anodization process, I kind of mentioned pickling. So really the question is, what is pickling, or what does it do? So if you kind of think about it, is the metal's going through the manufacturing process. Of course, there's going to be some dirt, maybe some grease and stuff on there, so they do a cleaning of that, and that can get rid of the majority of the dirt and everything. But the pickling process actually gets rid of any of the impurities or any of the stains or other instruments that other items that may be on top of that surface. So it really creates a clean blanket, clean surface that it can basically accept that anodization. So that's how you get the best finish.
Okay. Yeah, I saw that during the presentation. I wasn't sure. Pickling, we think of it a very different way, but that's interesting.
Yeah. It's not with a brine and some coriander seeds
right.
or whatever it is. No.
Gotcha. Okay. Here's another one question for you guys. Can a facility validate their own sets?
Yeah, we do get that a lot of times where people talk about validation. And, the big thing is that because of the detailed, if you kind of look at all the different testing we talked about, is, most facilities are not set up to do that level of testing. So the big thing is that they really do a verification. So the manufacturers of the instruments, the manufacturers of the sterile containers or sterile packaging will go through that process and go through the details and make sure that how should this be processed. And then the verification really comes at the facility, is that really where they're saying, here's what the IFU said, here's the end result we need to reach. If I go through to my steps, do I reach that same end result? I verified I can achieve that in my facility.
Gotcha. Yeah, and that differentiation between validation and verification, very important. That verification is done on our user end, yeah.
Well, and
if you
I
guys
think
have
even
questions,
people who, I was going to say just one last thing, and I think even people who know it well always just trip over the words because they're so close. So
they're so close. Yeah, and I think it's a cause for a lot of confusion because we'll say validation, we really mean verification, and vice versa. So yeah, I think it is just because the two words are so close to each other. If you guys have any more questions for Troy and Elmar, please put them in the Ask a Question section. I will highlight it on your screen there for you. But that's the section where you can ask questions of these guys while they're here and available. But I got another one for you here. The Esculap rigid containers, are they stackable even when there is a solid bottom? So that's another, I think, urban legend in sterile processing, that if there's not the holes and the filter on the bottom, it cannot be stacked. Is that accurate, or is that an urban legend?
I'll let you take this one, Elmar.
Yeah. Right. Well, the stackability of containers is kind of a basic requirement of our ISO and European standards for rigid sterile containers. So every container of the same type must be stackable during sterilization. Same type means manufacturers do not need to meet this requirement, but of the same type and family, the same brand, they must. That means there's always enough space, even if you stack containers, to remove air and to allow steam to penetrate during sterilization. The reason for the perforated bottoms has been kind of historical reasons. 20 years ago, still a lot of steam sterilizers use gravitational displacement processes to get the air off the sterile goods inside. Now, meanwhile, almost every hospital is running vacuum sterilizers where we do not need these lids, filters, and the lid and in the bottom. Because, for these gravitational procedures, we needed, how should I explain, the incoming steam
it pressed the air out of the package. So it was a downward replacement process, you could say. And that's where it comes from. It has nothing to do with stackability of containers.
Okay. And again, yeah, I think that it has to do with the pre-vacuum, that we're so used to these things coming down through the container that when they see a solid bottom, they're like, well, that can't possibly be pulling the steam out of that set, but it's not pulling it in that kind of unidirectional downward thing, right? It's kind of, it's able to escape the air anyway. So yes, it is an urban legend that you cannot stack those solid bottom trays. Do you guys have any advice on how users can avoid damage to these containers?
Yeah, I mean, it's just like anything else you own or any medical devices, proper handling and care is really the key. So all of our competitors, we really kind of outline as far as how the container should be handled, what processes you should use during the cleaning and the sterilization of it. So that's the biggest thing. But, containers can have a 10-year plus shelf or usable life. So, during that time, you're going to get some nicks and dents into it. The big thing is that if they're minor, it won't, change the functionality of the product whatsoever. If you do get a large dent in it, for example, or something, that may change how well the parts fit together. And then you should look at, getting those fixed, or depending on how bad they are, getting them replaced.
Right. And yeah, I mean, I as a consultant, I've gone into hospitals and they say, man, our containers it's really hard to get the lids to fit, and we're always sending them out for repair. And then I'll observe them, and they're just like throwing them onto the washer and like dumping them on the cart washer rack, and like you have to treat it like it's an expensive piece of metal that can break if you mistreat it. So just like anything else, if you mistreat those containers, they will bend, they will have issues. But if you treat them well and you treat them, a little bit more carefully, they will have an extended long life. So.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, just remember they're a Class 2 medical device. So,
yes, just like all the other Class 2 medical devices we have in the department. Yeah.
I mean, it's like
so the
with all type
presentation.
of packaging. Sorry, it's just it's same like with all type of packaging materials. If it's a pill pouch or a wrap, if you smash it on the table, excuse me for saying this that way, you will have an issue.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly right. So in the presentation, you guys talked about a little bit why aluminum is better than stainless steel because of the weight. But would containers made out of plastics possibly be another option? Is there a reason why that aluminum is like the best option out there?
I'll let you take this one, Elmar, too.
Yeah, thanks. Well, from a point of a manufacturer, plastic materials would have some benefits, especially that would be maybe more impact resistant, like an aluminum container. But on the other side, the big disadvantage of plastic materials, a little bit similar like stainless steel, is they do not have a good drying property. The heat storage capacity and heat conductivity of plastic material is by far not as good as aluminum. That means aluminum supports the drying during and after sterilization. This is one big thing. Secondly, plastic materials getting more affected by cleaning chemicals, or at least in a different way, more affected than aluminum surfaces. So from experiences with all kind of plastic parts in the markets, like handles for operating room lights or so, we know that they intend to crack after a certain time just because of this impact of cleaning chemistry on that. So at the end, for all manufacturers, it turned out to be still the best choice to go for aluminum. One could think about in the future different type of, I don't know, carbon fiber materials or whatever, but think about price of the things, of the materials as well. And also you need to kind of form or deep draw the container, which is way easy to be done with aluminum, but getting much more difficult with different materials. So there are a couple of different reasons why still, for the time being at least, aluminum is the material of choice for the manufacturers.
Gotcha. Very interesting stuff about the aluminum. So this one, over time, our containers have become very scratched up. is the container still good to use, or does that affect that anodization layer?
Mm-hmm. And that kind of overlaps a little bit with the other one you had, but so basically, as the anodization may get scratched, the container's still usable, assuming the rest of the function fits together like we were talking about properly. The only thing is if you got some severe scratch, you may get some oxidation or some other color change that may occur because of that. But those scratches are usually okay. At least they're not in the critical areas. Like if you have a lot of scratches, let's say around the top edge or something, that could hinder the gasket or something like that.
Right.
That's probably more of a dent than a scratch, but.
Yeah, I think over time, just the loading it on these metal racks, putting it on, when they stack them, the metal trays are stacked on top of each other. Over time, yeah, exactly. They sort of just get these little scratches or scrapes on them. It's not anything you can really feel with your finger, even. It's just sort of a line that you see on the container. So it's it is interesting to know, is that affecting the layer? And it seems like it does not. So that's great.
Yep.
So we talked about stacking the sets, and our urban legend of you can't stack the solid bottoms, which is false. So how high can they stack the instrument sets, and why is there a limit?
So in our IFU, we have 18 inches is our limit. So that's for the U.S. I don't know if the global is a little different, but for the U.S., that's ours. So why is there a limit? There's two reasons there's a limit. One, that's what we tested to, so that's all we can state. And the other one is that really more as you start stacking higher, it becomes unstable. So that's really a big thing is, we want to always look at patient safety and I should say employee safety, to make sure that they're not overstacking them and, we have a chance of it falling on them.
And Elmar, is that the same standard in Europe, the 18 inches stacking?
No, we do not have a standard for the height of stacking on that, but practically we follow the same principle. It has to be still safe for the use and for the patient at the end of the day. So we're ending up with the same principle. Also, it's not written in an ISO standard or defined in an ISO standard.
Gotcha. Okay. Very good stuff. We're out of time, but if you guys do have questions that we weren't able to get to, please check that speaker bio tool out in the right-hand corner of your screen and send Troy and Elmar a link. Thank you to Troy and Elmar for your expertise on these issues with sterilization packaging. Very interesting stuff on the manufacturing process. Just a reminder, there will be a short 15-minute break before that next session, and it's going to be a fun one. It'll be a panel talking about packaging shelf life and all those things that you would want to know about that. So we'll see you back here in about 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot.